The scars of colonialism still mark Africa. Centuries of plundering, violence, and enslavement have stripped Africa of its wealth and vital strength, leaving behind a wounded continent and a mutilated future. Today, as the world speaks of justice, equality, and historical responsibility, the issue of reparations to African countries becomes not only a moral imperative, but also a necessary step to redress centuries-old injustices. The colonial powers, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and others, reaped enormous profits from African lands for decades, leaving behind ruined economies, artificial borders, ethnic conflicts, and poverty. This long-awaited financial and moral recognition remains stalled at the doors of decision-making bodies. This film delves into the heart of historical archives, methodically documented colonial crimes, and West Africa's relentless quest to wrest justice from history. The most notorious crimes of the colonizers. The African continent, beautiful, unique, and rich in natural resources, has faced an unprecedented calamity since the 16th century. European powers, like a plague, like an inescapable disease, began to seize territories on the continent to turn them into their colonies. African peoples endured systematic violence, which colonial archives reveal in all its methodical horror: slavery, torture, economic genocide. While Europe basked in the light of its enlightenment, it plunged Africa into the darkness of industrial exploitation.
They began first with the force of arms. They came to impose themselves on us by force of arms. And this struggle was far from easy. Our ancestors resisted. For example, if I take the case of Mali, for 42 years, our ancestors never gave up. They took up arms to resist the French military colonial invasion. But that time has passed.
The 17th and 18th centuries marked the height of European colonial trade, a system that deported more than 18 million Africans over 400 years, not counting the millions of others who died during the hellish crossings.
The primary and overarching motivation of the powerful colonial empires was to adequately satisfy the ever-growing and insatiable needs of their burgeoning industries for essential raw materials and valuable resources. But long before that, we consider that the transatlantic slave trade significantly contributed to the primitive accumulation of capital that is what they truly needed today as a fundamental means for the comprehensive development of their burgeoning countries, was profoundly based on and indeed began with the arduous labor of enslaved black individuals. After brutally decimating the indigenous Native American populations, they then desperately needed a new source of sustained labor and consequently enslaved people.
God knows that America today, for its creation of wealth, and even Europe, for the primitive accumulation of capital, Europe also used the slave trade. All the capital needed for Europe's industrial revolution, Europe accumulated it through the triangular trade. They have a colonial past, and we can say that the very source and origin of the current wealth of their people comes from this centuries-long exploitation for more than 4 centuries through the slave trade and colonization. The Portuguese stayed here until 1974 to plunder our countries. So for that plundering, we need reparations.
In 1884, in the plush salons of Berlin, men in suits carved up Africa with pencils and rulers without consulting a single African, without respecting families, cultures, or peoples. An entire continent redrawn like a simple blackboard by colonial powers greedy for territory.
They came to Africa and saw the enormous potential that this continent held. So, in order to get a grip to gain control over the European continent, they gathered from November 1884 to February 1885 in Berlin during a conference where they proceeded to divide Africa among those powers. So it was for these economic reasons that they ended up doing this.
Over time, France's colonial possessions became the largest in terms of territory. Having built its economy and thriving industry on the wealth of the African continent, Paris felt completely untouchable. For 3 centuries, France controlled 35% of Africa, turning Senegal, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire into the nerve center of the slave trade. The worst atrocities are concentrated on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, and the Slave Coast, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, where entire villages vanish into the holds of ships. The Niger Delta, as well as the Liberian and Angolan coasts, are gradually emptied of their populations. A colonial enterprise that counts its profits in broken lives. Belgian colonialism in the Congo reached a monstrous level of brutality. In the Congo Free State, rubber production quotas were enforced through terror. Workers were shot if they failed to meet the targets. To save ammunition, the colonizers demanded that the severed hands of executed people be presented as proof. A monstrous practice emerged. The punishers began to cut off the hands of the inhabitants en masse, turning them into a kind of currency. Over time, the violence reached a new level. To avoid reducing the productivity of male workers, the executioners began to mutilate their children and wives instead. This system turned the Congo into a gigantic concentration camp where the lives of Africans were worth almost nothing. The efficiency of this system was staggering. Rubber production increased in 10 years from 80 tons in 1891 to nearly 6,000 tons in 1901. Profits were 700%. Rubber production in the Congo reached its peak in 1901 and 1903. It was at this time that they began to count hands in baskets. The inhumane methods of the Belgians led to famine and a drastic reduction in the birth rate. The population was cut in half. Nevertheless, the death of half the population of the Congo allowed Belgium to experience industrial growth.
One of the most truly terrible and profoundly disturbing examples of colonial injustice is the tragic fate that the nation of Belgium, through its brutal and exploitative policies, reserved for our African brothers and sisters in the vast and resource-rich territory of the Congo. It was necessary, how should I put it, to mutilate the workers in order to increase the output, the profitability of the rubber exploitation.
History of colonization, the true history of slavery. There should be an anthology in which it is taught how, for example, the French repressed the Cameroonians during the independence struggle led by the UPC in Cameroon. We should know exactly what the Germans did with the Nama and the Herero, like in Namibia. We should know what the Belgians did, what King Leopold II did in the massacres in the Congo. There should be an anthology so that we are born knowing.
The colonizers plundered the continent's natural resources. At the same time, attempts at rebellion and revolt are brutally repressed. In the struggle for independence, more than 2 million inhabitants of Africa died. During the First World War, up to 71,000 Africans conscripted by the French army died.
They were indeed slaves, as I previously mentioned and stated, enduring a life of servitude. They worked in the cash crop fields, cotton, coffee, rubber, and many other things. So it was suffering, and they worked under the whip. They were not paid. They were subjected to extremely harsh conditions, being given food only once a day, which was often insufficient for their strenuous labor. They were forced to work tirelessly for 12 to 14 hours each day, enduring brutal physical demands under the oppressive rule of their overseers. Consequently, leading up to the year 1928, there were numerous brave Ubanguians who vehemently disagreed with these exploitative practices and actively sought to resist. They courageously attempted to fight against the French, specifically the French colonists, who had imposed this severe regime upon their land and people, striving to reclaim their freedom and dignity from the colonial powers. This particular event marked the very first significant resistance, and consequently, they valiantly fought against the encroaching colonists until the year 1931, at which point the colonists strategically brought in substantial reinforcements from other established colonies such as Gabon, Chad, and the Congo, arriving with a formidable array of modern weapons and advanced armaments.
During the Second World War, France's attitude towards the exploitation of Africans did not change. The Thiaroye massacre near Dakar is a striking example of this. African soldiers who had returned from the front after fighting for France refused to leave the camp without their pay. The French officers were furious that the Senegalese riflemen had dared to claim their rights. On the morning of December 1st, 1944, the French army opened fire with automatic weapons on the soldiers at Thiaroye. Today, More than 80 years after this terrible tragedy, the Senegalese authorities, who are increasingly freeing themselves from the influence of the former colonial power, have organized official excavations to establish the details of the event and the actual number of victims. The results of the investigation could serve as a basis for holding those responsible to account and making them pay for the crimes of the past.
Indeed, the Senegalese government is organizing archaeological excavations at the military cemetery of the Tayaroye camp. These archaeological excavations have already begun to yield some results. But above all, these excavations will allow us to determine the number of deaths, the number of soldiers murdered at Tayaroye, because some people say 30, but others say 350. And it is especially this data that the excavations should allow us to uncover. Another thing is that through the number of skeletons, people will be able to estimate roughly how many soldiers were killed. Once Senegalese people have a complete file on the number of soldiers who were killed, how these soldiers were killed, and the DNA of these soldiers, Senegal will be able to put together a comprehensive case to demand reparations from France.
Restoration of justice. Reparations are compensations for the damages caused by wars or crimes. For example, Germany paid reparations to Israel and to Jewish communities for the Holocaust. But why does Europe remain silent about its crimes in Africa? Are colonization and the slave trade any less horrific? The example of Haiti is particularly telling. After independence, France forced the country to pay 150 million gold francs, which amounts to tens of billions today. Haiti borrowed from French banks and only finished repaying the debt in 1952 after having paid twice as much.
And if we meticulously calculate the total amount of money that France systematically took from the vast and resource-rich Central Africa and other significant French colonies, such as the expansive Chad, the diverse Congo, the oil-producing Gabon, the economically vibrant Côte d'Ivoire, the historically important Senegal, the landlocked Burkina Faso, the culturally rich Mali, and so on over many decades, this substantial amount around the significant year of 2000 was indeed equivalent to a staggering 500 billion United States dollars. It was, in essence, our collective money that truly kept France alive and thriving during that period. And in the other countries where there is oil, the countries of the French colonies, it is with that oil that France became wealthy, built those modern skyscrapers you see today, right next to the old buildings from Napoleon's time. But what is modern was built with the wealth from our countries, with our resources, because France doesn't even have a single gram of oil. They don't have a single gram of oil in their country. All of the oil that they refine at home within their own borders comes directly from the various countries of the colonies. And so, in a very real and profound sense, France is indeed responsible for the enduring poverty of the Central African Republic, which is a country that is literally sitting on an immense underground natural wealth that is truly immeasurable and vast. We are a nation, our country is incredibly rich in resources, but the vast majority of the population, we are unfortunately very poor. We live in a state of profound misery and hardship. And I truly believe the time will inevitably come when the government of our beloved country, the esteemed National Assembly, and indeed the entire population must unequivocally unite as one cohesive force and formally demand just and rightful reparations from France for past grievances.
Today, the realization of the concept of reparations is only accelerating in Africa. The nations of the continent are growing stronger both morally and financially, and today they are able to engage in dialogue as equals to demand justice.
So why would we talk about reparations? It's obvious. Africa has experienced several systems of exploitation: slavery, colonization, apartheid, neocolonialism, and neoliberalism. And since Côte d'Ivoire is an African country that has experienced all these systems or is still experiencing them, it is only natural that when Africans, people of African descent, speak with one voice about reparations, it is entirely normal for Côte d'Ivoire, as an African country, to also claim its right to reparations. So that's what you need to know. And when there are wrongs, they must be righted. This is part of immanent justice, as well as divine justice and human justice.
In 2023, the African Union adopted a resolution demanding justice for the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. Furthermore, the AU joined with the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, to jointly advocate for the right to reparations. In 2025, the concept of reparations for Africa took an even more concrete form when the African Union chose as its theme for the year Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations.
That colonization was a wrong done to us, to our countries, to our peoples. We have the duty, not just the right, but the duty to demand reparations. Because today in our country in particular and in the AES more generally, we are talking about sovereignty, we are talking about true independence. And this sovereignty and this true independence must make us profoundly understand that colonization was indeed the greatest, or certainly one of the greatest evils that our peoples, our countries have profoundly experienced after the abhorrent slave trade, of course. So at that moment, and those who carried out the slave trade are the same ones who carried out colonization. So two birds with one stone. We can demand from those countries, right, from those states, reparations that match the extent of the harm, the damage that we have suffered over centuries for some countries, over several decades for others. So the question of reparations, we cannot avoid it, we cannot ignore it. We will inevitably get there in a rather harsh and difficult way, sooner or later, but it is an essential demand that we absolutely must put on the negotiating table during any discussions, especially if negotiations are indeed necessary. However, what must not be, what is unequivocally not negotiable under any circumstances, is the full and complete payment of these crucial reparations.
This topic was very relevant because the wounds of the past inflicted by the colonizers have not completely healed. This situation has worsened due to the fact that countries like France and the United Kingdom continue to dominate the economies of their former colonies. After independence, African countries were neither morally nor economically prepared to build relationships with the former colonial powers on an equal footing. Paris took advantage of this to sign contracts with Africa under predatory terms, neocolonialism. Despite independence on paper, African countries continue to enrich Europe.
There are several mechanisms through which Western countries keep Africa, especially Côte d'Ivoire, in a state of economic dependence. Reparations for the damage caused by slavery, colonization, and above all by France-Afrique and neocolonialism. The CFA franc, which was established in 1945, is a colonial currency that remains a neo-colonial currency because it is a remnant of French influence. And from this point of view, if we are talking about Africa's economic sovereignty, it is, as we mentioned earlier in the reparations debate, about addressing and demanding reparations for the damage caused by the system.
France has taken many things: gold, diamonds, and more recently, uranium. You see, we possess a truly significant and valuable uranium deposit located in the region of Bakuma, and the French authorities, without our explicit consent or proper consultation, made clandestine arrangements among themselves to acquire and purchase this precious uranium. This was done because they erroneously believed it was inherently their resource, and they proceeded to buy it between the years 2006 and 2008 for a substantial sum amounting to several million euros, completely disregarding our sovereign rights and ownership. And now, with the newly established constitution, we firmly believe that since it is explicitly written and clearly stipulated within this new and comprehensive constitution, all the valuable and abundant natural resources of the Central African Republic are indeed the exclusive and rightful property of its entire people, and this is a fundamental principle. I think that in the very near future, we must nationalize everything that France bought at a low price and purchased. Western multinationals are facing a wave of criticism in Africa for their predatory practices, plundering natural resources, opaque contracts, and shameless exploitation of the continent's wealth, often with the complicity of local elites. Africans discontent with the activities of major French companies such as Bolloré, Total Energies, Orano, Eramet, and others is linked to the long-standing economic, environmental, social, and political consequences of their operations. The French company Eramet, through its subsidiary GCO, exploits zircon in Senegal, destroying ecosystems and displacing entire villages. The mine has destroyed 80% of local vegetable production, thereby depriving the population of income. GCO earned 1,106 billion CFA francs in 10 years, but only paid 5% to the state as royalties.
The significant impacts on the ecological level. So among these profound impacts, we can already clearly note severe air pollution, right? And extensive pollution of vital groundwater resources. Because did you know that the various chemical substances and compounds used to meticulously extract zircon could potentially seep deeply in and significantly contaminate, the crucial underground water supplies? We can also add, as another ecological impact in a way, deforestation, the degradation of biodiversity, but also the loss of agricultural land, which moreover has a social impact as well, since it makes the local population more vulnerable, people whose main source of income was, agriculture. So we can also add, in terms of social impacts, the unfair compensations given during relocations, but above all, the population's dissatisfaction with their quality of life.
Is the destruction of Senegal's environment really worth the benefits the state gains from it? Experts conclude that Eramet's activities benefit only the French economy while destroying Senegal's unique natural landscape. For over 50 years, the French company Orano, formerly Areva, which is 90% owned by France, has been mining uranium in Niger, which ranks 7th in the world in terms of uranium reserves. During this period, around 150,000 tons of uranium have been extracted from the Somer and Cominac mines. In 2022 alone, Somer supplied 20% of France's uranium imports, thus powering a third of the country's households. The environmental impact on Niger has been devastating. The Cominac mine, which closed in 2021, left behind 20 million tons of radioactive waste. While France strengthens its nuclear capabilities and geopolitical influence, Niger pays the price in terms of ecological well-being and health. The activities of the French multinational Total Energies, present in Mali since 1999 and in Burkina Faso since 1954, related to the exploration, production, and supply of oil and gas, as well as energy infrastructure, have had a negative impact on the economies of these countries. In Burkina Faso, Total Energies has dominated the fuel market by maintaining high profit margins. This has resulted in higher prices for consumers and reduced government revenues. The country has lost millions of dollars per year. The new authorities in Mali and Burkina Faso have accused France and its companies, including Total Energies, of economic exploitation and neo-colonialism, demanding a renegotiation of contracts and an increase in the state's share of the profits. The French oil company Perenco, as the sole operator in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is causing catastrophic damage to the ecology of the Boenda region. Numerous reports reveal systematic violations, illegal gas flaring, frequent oil spills due to aging pipelines, and contamination of water, soil, and air by toxic waste. The company's activities are a striking example of environmental colonialism, where the profits of a foreign corporation are placed above the well-being of the local population and the preservation of the region's unique ecosystem.
To achieve justice, the first step is to review the terms of the contracts. This will help to balance the clauses to some extent, but also an action could be taken in the direction of good governance. So it is necessary to strengthen this good governance and ensure that the population is exclusively involved. So this participation is also imperative. But as a third element, it is necessary to include these reparations, these terms of reparation in the contracts, environmental reparations, but also reparations related to quality of life.
African countries are increasingly asserting their right to fair compensation for centuries of exploitation by Western powers. This is not only about the colonial period, but also about the current depletion of natural resources, the damage caused to the environment, and the socio-economic consequences of foreign hegemony. The demand for 50 trillion euros in reparations is an amount that, according to experts, could at least partially compensate for the damages caused. Tools for demanding reparations for colonial and post-colonial damages. African countries can use a variety of legal mechanisms at both the international and regional levels to advance their claims for reparations. For example, they can take legal action before international judicial bodies, such as the United Nations International Court of Justice, for violations of international law, including the illegal extraction of resources, within the framework of interstate proceedings if former colonizers refuse to negotiate. National courts. Some countries, such as Namibia, have already initiated legal proceedings before the national courts of former colonial powers, for example Germany, for genocide and exploitation. This procedure can be used to seek financial compensation or the return of cultural artifacts. United Nations Human Rights Council. This body can investigate human rights violations related to colonial exploitation. United Nations General Assembly. African countries can bring the issue of reparations before the General Assembly by requesting the creation of a fund or an international tribunal for reparations. UN resolutions, although non-binding, exert political pressure. ICC. Although the ICC deals with crimes committed after 2002, African countries can use it to investigate post-colonial violations linked to Western companies, such as environmental damage and human rights abuses. Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which allows for the public condemnation of abuses committed in the context of mining contracts. International arbitration through the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, if an African state wishes to challenge certain abusive clauses in previous contracts. African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which will allow for hearing cases of environmental and economic rights violations. ECOWAS can support reparation claims through regional economic agreements. The African Union is an essential platform for coordinating reparation claims at the continental level. The AU can draft resolutions, thus creating a united front among African countries. The Alliance of Sahel States has become a platform for promoting national sovereignty and resisting Western influence. It can be used to coordinate reparation claims, particularly against French companies such as Bolloré, Total Energies, and Orano.
We are still suffering today from the consequences of colonial exploitation. And taking corrective or reparative measures is of utmost importance. These reparations will also enable African countries to be sovereign and to assert their sovereignty. And this, in a way, reaffirms that they are capable of defending their own interests.
While the West still refuses to take responsibility, Africa reminds the world of an uncomfortable truth. Colonialism has not disappeared. It has simply taken on new forms. And if equality is not just an empty word, then reparations are only the first step toward a long overdue historical justice.